Hello, everyone. I'm Jay Mather, the Chief Executive of Carbon Free Group. We're based in the United Kingdom, and we specialize in connected innovation in the clean tech and climate space. So this conference is all about sustainability and about the environment. One of the things that's really important here is many businesses and companies and individuals and governments are still looking at sustainability as an optional thing on the edge. It's something that we still need to do, and we'll get around to it. And it's gradually building momentum. But I like to start with this graph because this is a really important graph that shows that this isn't about one thing. This isn't about CO2 concentration, which is that dark blue line. This is actually about everything. Every major indicator in the world, be it temperature increase, population, CO2, woodland extraction, water use, ozone depletion, fisheries exploitation, paper consumption, every one of them is doing this exact same thing in one degree or another, which is logarithmic growth, perpetual growth. Perpetual growth is something that we as a society have come to believe is normal, is desirable, is the only way things can be. But perpetual growth only exists in systems with infinite amount of resource, and those systems don't exist. So perpetual growth in nature, you can see in things like cancer. When a cancer cell starts to grow, it loses its ability to understand feedback loops. It's a communication problem. Cancer cells no longer receive signals from the cells around them saying that they've grown big enough and they need to stop. So they continue to grow and they eventually overwhelm and start to kill off the healthy cells. That model is exactly what humans are doing right now. We are perpetually growing and ignoring the feedback loops around us. Now, there's a lot of big indicators that are starting to show that we have a whole raft of issues around the big picture in climate change. Like all these big things, 50% drop in biodiversity over the next 100 years. We're in the middle of the great extinction event, the fifth one on the planet. The other four were caused by nature. The fifth one's caused by us. Concentrations of CO2 are locking us into at least a meter of sea level rise by 2100. Now, a meter of sea level rise will wipe out a significant proportion of the Earth. At least 5 to 10% of the planet's land masses will be gone. What else is key about that is our alluvial deltas, which is where we have the highest food productivity in the world, all sit within that 1 meter sea level rise. So that means we're also, at the same time that the oceans are going to increase, be losing some of our most valuable farmland. Over the last 30 years, coral reefs have shrunk by 38%. Coral reefs are the nurseries of our oceans, food streams, and food chains. If we burn the world's proven fossil fuels, we're going to raise temperatures by 6 degrees. Basically, the world's finally committed to 2 degrees Celsius, maximum temperature raise. That means that 2/3 of all known fossil fuel reserves that already have been identified can never be used. And what's really interesting here is the value of fossil fuel companies are based on proven resource extraction and resource allocation and reserves. So the reality is we're still playing a game here where we're valuing companies in the fossil fuel sector based on things they can never, ever be allowed to use if we want to stay within that 2 degrees agreement. We also have started to experience extreme weather events all over the world. 14 of the 15 hottest year on record have happened since 2000. This is accelerating. Now, when it comes to pollinators, this is a really important point because there are a lot of visits of pollinators needed to produce things. Like blueberry, 2 to 3 visits, apple, 2 to 4, and then you go all the way down. A typical handful of blueberries is 150 pollinator visits. A cup of coffee, 1,000 visits. And since 1950, we've lost over 50% of the world's honeybee populations, and 1/3 of every bite of food that humans eat relies on insects for pollination. Remember when we used to drive around and get insects all over the front of the vehicles? Well, we don't get that anymore because we are in the middle of a massive crash in pollinators, which has vast knock-on effects for our species. We often can look at this from a carbon tunnel vision point of view. As I said in the very beginning, that carbon emissions are the key thing, and they are. But this is actually about everything: resource scarcity, inequality, overconsumption, affordability, pollutants, ecotoxicity, biodiversity loss, poverty, eutrophication, water crisis, health, and education. If we don't keep an eye on all those interrelated things, then we will miss the mark because you cannot deal with just 1 or 2 or 3 of those and solve the challenge. And also on the right, what science is telling us is that we're exceeding the capability of the natural systems to handle our behavior in so many ways. Novel entities being a bunch of chemicals we're adding into the environment that are not normally bioavailable. An example, bioplastics. The oceans are now littered with bioplastics. Climate change is obviously one of those things that's a big one too, but so too is the biosphere starting to collapse. So too is land system change. We're altering the way land works. So too is biogeochemical flows. These are deep, deep issues. And there's a bunch of other issues like fresh water and ocean acidification that are also increasingly getting to the point where they're moving beyond what nature can handle. So in essence, it's almost like there's a house on fire and the world's behaving like we take this raging inferno very seriously. And we're proud to announce that our ambitious new target to slow the speed at which this spreads by 5%. That's effectively what we're doing as a species. And if you look over to the right, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. This is quite significant. The loss of plant species at 2 degrees is 2 times what it is at 1.5. Loss of insects, 3 times worse. Degradation of coral reefs, 99% at 2 degrees. And that is basically where we're going, even if we hit all of our targets. Extreme heat events are 2.6 times worse at 2 degrees versus 1.5. Bearing in mind right now, the world's experiencing 1 degree Celsius already. So we're already feeling the effects of this. And a C3 ice in the Arctic, well, there's a 10 times higher chance of that happening at 2 degrees. Times change, and so do the tools of the trade. We are in a time of humongous shifts in our society, in our economy, in our civilizations. And resource wars are actually something that we're going to be seeing more likely raging because we're running into big challenges. We are seeing that hiccups that occur around the world have vast impacts on our supply chains because our supply chains are so deeply interconnected with each other. Now, this graph, this image shows you the main different ways that society behaves. On the very bottom, you have conventional. Basically, this is degenerative culture. So conventional business is staying within the law, and it's about gradually degenerating and depleting the world's energy reserves, the world's mineral reserves, the world's bioreserves. And as we move to green, they're a little less negative. And what's really, really interesting there is you move in the middle, that's sustainable. So this is why green is not enough. Green is a little less bad. Sustainable is merely breaking even. What we actually need to be doing is shifting more to the right, into restoratives. So we're doing things to nature to help nature, and eventually to regeneratives. We're doing things as nature. So what's interesting on the top left, you see that original graph from the beginning of my presentation. Sustainable is merely leveling off. Restorative is starting to go down a little bit, but regenerative is taking things much, much further down, back to a place below where we originally were. So we actually create a better environment, a better ecosystem because of our behavior than we did beforehand. So sustainable, simply put, isn't enough. The SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, sit in the middle. And those are the big 17 goals which try to encompass all of these complex interrelationships. But it's really, really important. And as a sustainability executive, one of the things I've sort of rallied against for my whole career is don't talk green. Don't talk saving the planet. Don't even talk sustainable anymore. This is about restorative and regenerative. That's where everything has to go. The planet doesn't care whether we solve this problem or not. It has been through great extinction events. This is about us. Do we want to solve these challenges or not? Do we want to thrive or not? It's a choice. This is about bridging the gap that exists between where we are and where we want to or say or need to be. So there's 5 levels of corporate responsibility maturity. What we've got is deniers, short-term interest focus, greed is good, which is probably about 25% of businesses. Compliers, where the potential cost of profits is larger than the cost of compliance. Therefore, there is a motivation for change basically to comply with the law. And that's where the vast majority of companies sit and governments in the world. Then we have risk mitigators. So those are organizations that believe that preventing a problem is more profitable and better business than reacting to a problem. So these are the preactors as opposed to the reactors, a smaller, then again, still chunk of society. We have opportunity maximizers who have moved beyond risk mitigation, and they seek to minimize negative social, environmental, and economic impact and to maximize positive impacts, including developing new business opportunities. And in this conference, you will hear of many of those. Then we have champions. And these are organizations who are a vision of what a truly sustainable or regenerative organization is. They're intent on changing the game. Commercial strategy is sustainability strategy. They're not separate. There isn't a person on the edge in an eco team. They're sitting at the C-suite at the core of decision making. The board acts as visionaries, promoting governance and sustainability to others. That is where we've got a handful of companies in the world. That number is growing. Organizations like the B Corp movement are starting to shift that way much more readily. We have the Science-Based Targets Initiative with an example of over 2,000 companies that are now signing up to take a part of the decision-making about what they do when it comes to the environment outside of their hands and handing it to external body that then says, this is who you are, this is how you behave, and these are the things you would need to do in order to comply with your own goals. So that's beginning to grow, and it's an exciting time. Now, this is a really interesting graph. It shows you the corporate climate action is accelerating, but it's still very insufficient. On the left-hand side, this is organizations, percentages of each of these main sectors that were assessed that have no or partial emission disclosure in place. So what you see there is financial institutions at the bottom. 81% of global financial institutions are not taking any of this stuff seriously. Now, the financial institutions are the ones that are funding ultimately everything else, everything above: transport, manufacturing, apparel, food, beverage, energy, infrastructure, materials. So they are the gatekeepers, and still only a small percentage, 8%, have emission reduction plans in place that are realistic and moving forward. 9% have reduction targets in place. Only a couple percent have full emission disclosure. And what's funny about that is this is disclosure about their scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions is where you start to talk about your handprint, not your footprint. Footprint, of course, what is the impact of your operations? Handprint is what is the impact of your actions and your supply chain and your finances. So it's really interesting seeing that energy has taken this on more than others, which makes sense because in that energy category, you have everything from coal and fossil fuels all the way up to renewable energy. But there still is a insufficient reaction to the circumstance we find ourselves in. Now, I love this image because it says it so succinctly. I love you, but I love fossil fuels more. This is the message that humanity is saying to the next generation. It's simply put, we love the ease of the energy that fossil fuels provide. And a good example of that is a barrel of oil has as much energy in it as roughly 2.5 workers working full-time in labor in a year. So you start to put things in perspective. That barrel of oil can do a vast amount of work for us. And that's why we've come to build our entire civilization on that oil and on natural gas. What we didn't fully understand was the impacts of that energy use was a thing called biosphere collapse and climate change, which is really interesting because now that we know, and we have known for over 30 years, we're slowly reacting to that, but not nearly fast enough because we're the first generation in human history that are actually actively working towards making the next generation's life much worse than ours. So this is a time for increased urgency and deep collaboration for systems change. Our times call for ambition, not caution, and business advocacy, not risk aversion. Aaron Kramer. That's such an incredibly important message at this point in time. This is all about ambition. This is about urgency. This is about deep collaboration. This is also not about blaming. It's about working together with systems integration. And as Bill McKibben says, it's not an investment if it's destroying the planet, because ultimately it doesn't matter how much money you make off your investment if it's obliterating your ability to make money in the future or your ancestors' abilities. First Nations and Indigenous peoples around the world typically have a much longer perspective on all this. In Canada, where I'm from, there's a thing called the 7-generation view, which is that decisions are made based on how will the next 7 generations be affected by those decisions. That's a very ancient way of thinking that we have lost our way to, because if we had taken into account even just one generation in front of us, our children, many of our actions would be very, very different. Now, we have choices here. None of this is written in stone. We have vast opportunities to make different decisions and to lead ourselves in a completely different way. And this is that precipice point for the human race and all of our experiences and civilizations. Which route do we take? We have the answers. We have the technologies. We actually have the money. The question is, do we step up? And that's what we got to find out. Have a great conference.